John Price's life was a living nightmare, constantly tormented by his abusive girlfriend, Katherine Knight. But despite his best efforts to protect himself and his children, John's worst nightmare became a reality when he failed to show up for work the day after taking out a restraining order against Katherine. As police arrived at his home, the unmistakable stench of blood filled the air, and their hearts sank as they prepared for the worst. But nothing could have prepared them for the sheer horror that awaited them inside the house as they uncovered a grisly scene that defied belief. From that moment on, the shocking and deeply disturbing events that transpired would send shockwaves throughout the community and the world at large. Katherine Knight was born on October 24, 1955, in a sleepy town nestled in the scenic Hunter Valley of New South Wales. Her mother, Barbara Ruffin, was married to Jack Ruffin, and together they had 4 children. But fate had different plans for this family, as Barbara's infidelity with a co-worker and friend of Jack's, Ken Knight, shattered their lives. This scandalous affair rocked the tight-knit community, and Barbara was forced to flee with Ken to Moree, leaving her 4 children behind. In Moree, Barbara started a new life with Ken and bore him 4 more children, including twin girls. One of these girls was named Katherine, a name that would later become synonymous with a dark and gruesome tale of murder and mayhem. Katherine's childhood was marked by trauma and abuse. As we delve deeper into her family history, we learn that Katherine's father was an alcoholic who often resorted to violence and intimidation to assert his control over those around him. But it was Katherine's mother, Barbara, who bore the brunt of this violence. She was repeatedly sexually assaulted by her husband, leaving her scarred both physically and emotionally. Sadly, the abuse didn't end there. According to Katherine, she was a victim of sexual assault at the hands of several family members, including her own siblings. This abuse began when she was just a child of 11 years old, and it continued for years. Katherine was an innocent child who was robbed of her childhood and forced to endure such unspeakable horrors. It's hard to imagine the pain and suffering she must have endured and the scars that must have lingered long after the abuse had ended. As we continue to explore the life of Katherine Knight, a portrait of a troubled and complex woman begins to emerge. Despite the deep-seated trauma and abuse that she endured throughout her childhood, Katherine was able to form a deep bond with her uncle, Oscar Knight. So when Oscar took his own life in 1969, Katherine was left reeling. She claimed that his ghost still visits her, a haunting reminder of the pain and loss that she has endured. The family moved back to Aberdeen after Oscar's death, hoping to find some semblance of normalcy in their hometown. But for Katherine, the pain and trauma of her past continued to haunt her. She attended Muswellbrook High School, where she quickly gained a reputation as a bully. It's clear that the abuse she suffered at the hands of her family had taken a toll on her, leaving her struggling to find her place in the world. Eventually, Katherine left school early and began working as a fabric cutter in a clothing factory. A year later, she landed her dream job at a slaughterhouse cutting out the internal organs of animals. It was during this time that she developed a habit that would stay with her for the rest of her life, hanging knives over her bed in case she needed them. As we reflect on Katherine's early years, it's clear that her life was marked by tragedy, trauma, and loss. As we delve deeper into the troubled life of Katherine Knight, we are faced with a disturbing web of violence, manipulation, and horror. Her first relationship with David Kellett was marked by intense passion and destructive tendencies. Katherine met David in 1973 at work, and within a year, she was demanding that they get married. But their wedding night was a harbinger of the darkness to come. Katherine flew into a rage and attempted to strangle David after he fell asleep, frustrated with their lack of intimacy. Their marriage was characterized by extreme violence, with Katherine frequently lashing out at David in fits of rage. The police even wanted to charge her with assault, but she managed to convince David to drop the charges. When David left her for another woman and moved away, Katherine was unable to cope with the pain and abandonment. She was seen thrashing a stroller with their baby down the main street, a chilling sight that spoke to her unraveling mental state. After being admitted to St. Elmo's Hospital for postnatal depression, Katherine placed her 2-month-old baby on a railway line and went into town, threatening to kill people with an axe. Though fate intervened and a local forager rescued the baby before the train came, Katherine's descent into madness was far from over. She was arrested and taken back to St. Elmo's Hospital, only to sign herself out the next day. A few days later, she demanded that a neighbor take her to see David, but when the woman refused, Katherine cut her face with a knife. Her actions were so alarming that she was disarmed by police and sent to Morrissey Psychiatric Hospital. It was here that she revealed her dark intentions to a psychiatrist, plotting to kill the mechanic who fixed David's car, and even threatening to murder David and his mother. Despite all of this, David left his girlfriend and returned to Aberdeen to support Katherine, and they even had another daughter. But ultimately, the toxicity of their relationship was too much to bear, and Katherine left David and moved away on her own. In 1986, she met David Saunders, and despite a tumultuous start, he moved in with her and her 2 daughters. But Knight's jealousy was consuming, and she would often throw Saunders out of the house. Then, in May 1987, Knight committed a horrific act of cruelty in front of Saunders. She cut the throat of his beloved puppy as a reminder of what she would do to him if he ever cheated on her. But that was just the beginning. Knight gave birth to another daughter the following year, but her anger only grew stronger. Saunders was on the receiving end of her rage, enduring a brutal attack that left him with a stab wound to the stomach and a blow to the face with an iron. Fearing for his life, Saunders went into hiding, and Knight was unable to find him. The story of Katherine Knight's tumultuous love life continued with her relationship with John Chillingworth, which resulted in the birth of a son, Eric, in 1991. However, their love didn't last long, and Knight moved on to John Price, who she had been seeing for a while. The true extent of Knight's twisted psyche was beginning to reveal itself, and it was only a matter of time before she would take her violence to a whole new level. Katherine and John Price's relationship was far from a fairy tale. Knight's violent temper soon resurfaced, and Price became the victim of her rage. John Price was known as a beloved man in his community, a kind father and hard-working miner who always had a smile on his face. Despite Price knowing of Knight's violent reputation, that did not stop him in pursuing a relationship with her. For a time, their relationship seemed to be without trouble, but as with many of Knight's relationships, it would soon take a dark turn. In 1998, Knight demanded that Price marry her, but he refused. In response, Knight launched a vicious retaliation against him by recording a tape of Price stealing items from work and sending it to his boss. Price was promptly fired from the job he had held for 17 years, leaving him without a steady income. In the heat of the moment, Price kicked Knight out of his home, and she returned to her home. Months later, Price made the mistake of seeing Knight again, but he refused to let her move back in with him. Knight's behavior quickly escalated to violent outbursts. It was a dark and ominous night in February 2000 when Price returned home from work. He followed his usual routine of checking in with the neighbors before settling into bed. Little did he know that his routine was about to be violently interrupted. Katherine returned home after him and went about her own routine before going upstairs to bed, but she had something much more sinister in mind. Katherine woke Price, seducing him into intimacy, but what followed was a terrifying and fatal assault that would leave Price fighting for his life. In a fit of rage, Knight took a butcher knife from next to her bed and stabbed Price 37 times. Despite his valiant efforts to fight her off, he was unable to stop her attack. The evidence showed that Price woke up during the ordeal, but was unable to defend himself. In a macabre twist, Knight then dragged his lifeless body downstairs, leaving behind a trail of blood that would lead to her inevitable downfall. The next morning, Price's co-workers were left reeling from his ominous warning, realizing that he had been tragically prophetic. They quickly called the police after he failed to show up for his shift. The search for John Price was about to uncover a web of violence and horror that no one could have imagined. The scene was straight out of a horror movie. The police arrived to a quiet house, but what they found inside was anything but peaceful. Katherine Knight, comatose and unresponsive, was immediately taken into custody. When she finally came to, she claimed to have no memory of the previous night. As the police began to search the house, they discovered a boiling pot on the stove. But this was no ordinary pot of stew. Inside, they found John Price's head, surrounded by a macabre mix of vegetables. Nearby, on the dining table, were 2 plates, each with a name written on them. It was a chilling revelation. Katherine Knight had planned to serve John Price's body parts to his own children. Despite Knight's claims of amnesia, the evidence was damning. She had decapitated John's body and cooked his head with an array of vegetables. She had also roasted cuts of his flesh in the oven. The dishes were set out on the table, complete with place cards bearing messages to Price's children. The entire scene was like something out of a nightmare. But the horror didn't end there. The police discovered an additional piece of Price's cooked buttocks in the backyard. It was clear that Knight had engaged in cannibalism before disposing of the remains for her dogs to eat. The investigation was a grisly affair, but one thing was certain. Katherine Knight was responsible for the death of John Price, and her actions were beyond comprehension.
Today, she became the first woman to be jailed for life under truth in sentencing laws, ensuring she'll die behind bars. She's been branded a danger to the community, capable of murdering anyone who crosses her.
As the trial of Katherine Knight began in October of 2001, everyone braced themselves for a long and arduous legal battle. But to the surprise of everyone present, Knight abruptly changed her plea to guilty, cutting the proceedings short. The judge immediately adjourned the case without any testimony or cross-examination. As Knight was led away to prison that day, the world was left reeling. For the first time in Australian history, a woman was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her papers were marked, never to be released, but even as the doors of the prison slammed shut, Knight remained defiant. She continued to maintain her innocence, refusing to accept responsibility for the unspeakable atrocities she had committed. Over the years, Knight has appealed her sentence multiple times, desperate for even the slightest chance of freedom. But time and time again, her appeals have been denied, and she remains incarcerated at Silverwater Women's Correctional Center to this day. As the credits roll on this harrowing tale, one can't help but wonder what twisted motivations drove Katherine Knight to commit such heinous acts, and whether she will ever truly come to terms with the magnitude of her crimes.